So we're going to continue to talk about the theory of evolution and Darwin's basis for his theory of evolution. We are talking about survival of the fittest. I am sure you guys have heard of survival of the fittest, and this is where only the strong will survive. So those individuals that are the fittest, they have the best genes, they are best adapted to their environment, they are more likely to survive and reproduce and pass those strong genes on to them, to the next generation. This is what we refer to as natural selection. Natural selection means that the weak do not survive. Those who are strong, those who have the best genes, those who are best adapted to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. Natural selection means that the weak, the sick, the ones with not the best genes, they don't survive to reproduce. Remember, an adaptation is a feature that has become common because it provides some type of advantage. Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection is supported by four major points. One, that variation exists within genes of every population of species. Two, some individuals of the population are better suited to survive and have more offspring, therefore passing on the better genes. Three, traits that make certain individuals of a population better able to survive tend to spread through that population. And there is overwhelming evidence from fossils that many other sources that these living species that we have now evolved from organisms that are extinct. There are also four factors that influence natural selection. And they are that all populations have genetic variety. The environment will present challenges to successful reproduction, predators, lack of food sources, illnesses, things along those lines. Individuals tend to produce more offspring than the environment can support. So when we talk about animals, when they have offspring, they produce a great deal of offspring in hopes that some of them can survive. Not all of these organisms will survive, but by having more, they're giving it a good likelihood that a percentage will survive. And the individuals that are better able to cope with the challenges in their environment are more likely to have offspring and more offspring that are suited to that environment and will thus survive. So it took Darwin a long time to publish this theory. And it took him a long time to publish this theory because of the environment in which existed in the early 1800s. Remember, religion controlled everything. And when we're talking about that, what we mean is that, like, if you went against the church, you would basically be ostracized in the community. You would be kicked out. You wouldn't be allowed to participate in things. They would look at your family and look down upon your family. So it was a very different time. And the only reason that Darwin published his work when he did is because somebody else had a similar idea and they were about to publish it. And Darwin did not want somebody else getting credit for his theory. So he published it. And his book that he published was called The Origin of Species. And it contained a lot of evidence about evolution. And he proposed a very reasonable explanation for how evolution occurs. Now, he didn't have all of the answers, but he also knew that it was a good idea. And he was willing to accept other scientists' ideas, and he was open to new ideas. Another scientist that we talk about is Lamarck. And Lamarck was one of the first scientists to suggest that species change over time. And this was really supported by the growing fossil record that we had, that everything does evolve and change over time. Lamarck proposed a theory that organisms changed over natural selection. So, like, By selectively using their body parts, he thought that they changed. So giraffes got their long necks by reaching and reaching and reaching for leaves, taller and taller and taller trees. We know that that's not how it works, but they didn't have all the scientific knowledge that we have now. But he thought that if a species acquired something during their lifetime, then they passed that change on to their offspring. So if you got a scar or you lost a finger or something, it would be like you passed that on to your children when you had children. And we know that that's not the way it works. So another example of this would be that a crane had to wade into deeper and deeper water. And that crane started with short legs. And as it waded into deeper and deeper water, it started to grow longer and longer legs. So then when it had babies, then that baby would have longer legs. We know that that's not the way it works, but this was the start of the idea that things change over time. And part of what we know that was wrong with his is that he thought that animals had an innate sense that they should be more perfect over time. But what's important is that he was the first naturalist to suggest that species are not fixed, that they don't stay the same, that they do change over time. And he also recognized that there's a link between an organism's environment and their body structures and those adaptations. So let's talk about some evidence for evolution. Another theory that we need to talk about that ties into evolution is plate tectonics and the idea of Pangea. When we talk about plate tectonics is the idea that our land is on a series of plates that slowly move and drift because of the Earth's molten core. This is the idea of continental drift. And what we had was a huge continent, a supercontinent, and over time that supercontinent separated and divided until we have what we have our present day continents. This idea is based on the idea of Pangea. Pangea means whole land, and Pangea is that idea that all of the continents were one supercontinent like 250 million years ago. And physical forces separated it, those shifting things. But we also have the idea that species are going to be separated and be forced to change because of these physical forces. So not only was that supercontinent separated, but you would have plates that would take and collide and form mountains. We would have water that changes the course of things, separates different species, and they are forced to change over time. Because of these changes, we also have changes in the global environment and the way the weather and that is. And again, this forces evolution to occur because animals need to adapt to change to the new environments or they will become extinct. So when you have species that are separated by different things, waters like the oceans, mountains, they all start to form and evolve in a different way. Fossils play a great role in supporting this. Fossils are important for telling us a lot of information about species that are no longer living. Nearly all fossils are formed in sedimentary rock. And what happens is that these body structures of these living organisms are left behind. Researchers can use this to link evolutionary relationships and form hypotheses on how these species may be related. So how are fossils formed? Well, to simplify it, animals die, the soft parts rot away, the hard parts are buried under mud, debris, things like that. Pressure is applied to those, minerals fill in the spaces, and they turn to stone. We can tell how old something is by using relative dating. Relative dating tells us basically where they're located in those layers of rock, tell us how old they are. So we can go down, and the deeper we go, we know the older they are because we're sequencing those things. And using this relative dating, we can actually date our fossils. Index fossils are ones that we know how old they are, and then we can compare those to the other fossils and help that in our dating process. Radiometric dating is looking at the isotopes and how quickly they are breaking down. This is a little bit more accurate because it gives us more information about how it is because we're using this radiometric dating. And we know how old it is because isotopes break down at a certain rate. Another thing that we can look at is comparative embryology to support evolution. When we look at embryos and the developmental stages of many vertebrates, they look very similar. These patterns of embryological development provide further evidence that these animals descended from a common ancestor. Other evidence is using biochemistry. When we look at the biochemistry, we can look at the biochemical differences between these organisms, and we can compare these, and we can compare DNA, things like that, and we can compare that in the fossil record to help us figure out if an organism had a common ancestor or not. Another thing that we look at is something called homologous structures. These are similarities in anatomy that leads us to believe that they had a common ancestor and they just started to develop different. These similarities tell us how recently they evolved and shared a common ancestor. A good example of this is looking at the limbs of mammals. If you look at the different mammals there, you can see a lot of similarities in those mammals and the bone structures. And this helps us figure out if and when we had a common ancestor. An analogous structure is a body part that shares a common function, but not structure. So this would be like wings. If we look at the wings of a bee, a butterfly, and a bird, they're all used for the same things, but their structures are very different. When we look at vestigial structures, they are inherited from our ancestors, but they have lost the function that they probably once had. So when we look at this, your appendix and your tailbone. So your tailbone was probably the remnants of a tail from a common ancestor that you shared. These are vestigial structures. They're things that have lost their original function. Again, more support or more evidence for evolution.